Between 1876 and 1906, something unprecedented occurred in the architectural record of human civilization. Not just in one city, not in one region. Across 3 continents, simultaneous, coordinated, internally consistent. Towering buildings of breathtaking geometric complexity rose from the earth using technology, labor organization, and material science that should not, by any reasonable accounting, have existed at that particular moment in time. I'm not saying what everyone immediately thinks I'm saying. I'm not invoking any extraordinary explanation. What I am saying is this: the photographic record is incomplete in a specific way. The technical documentation is oddly fragmentary, and the coordination problem, the supply chains, the logistics, the labor mathematics, has never been adequately explained. We have construction photos from 1911 onward, detailed ones, multiple angles. We have Beaux-Arts specifications. We have brick-by-brick documentation from the 1920s. But the buildings that rose before that, the ones that established the pattern, the ones that showed the architects what was possible, we have finished structures. We have dedication ceremonies. We have newspaper celebrations. What we do not have, in the quantity or granularity that the scale of these projects demands, is the documentation of how they were actually built. That's the question nobody wants to ask, not the romantic version, the actual version. How? Let me start, as all good forensic work must, with a specific, verifiable, uncontested fact. In 1876, the Second Empire Building, what we now call the Palace Hotel, opened in San Francisco. 7 stories, cast iron, hydraulic elevators, spanning an entire city block. The official narrative is clean and complete. It was designed by William Pereira. It was the largest hotel in the world. It took 2 years to build. Moving on. But when you actually look at the photographs of its construction, something peculiar presents itself. We have before photos, San Francisco rubble, demolished buildings, cleared earth. We have after photos, the finished palace with its mansard roof and iron filigree visible in extraordinary detail. What lies between? Sparse, fragmentary, single angles. No comprehensive sequence of stages. No visual documentation of the intermediate steps that any rational person would expect from a project of this magnitude. This is not simple archival incompleteness. Photography was not new in 1876. It was mature, expensive, yes, but for a project that cost the equivalent of $40 million in modern currency. Not prohibitively expensive. Major newspapers documented major building projects. That was standard practice. Yet the construction sequence for the Palace Hotel, it reads more like a time-lapse than a documentary. Suddenly, the foundation is in. Suddenly, the frame is rising. Suddenly, the exterior is complete. The intermediate stages, the ones that would reveal the actual logistics, the labor organization, the sequencing of material delivery, are simply absent from the photographic record. Now, let me be clear what I'm not saying. I'm not claiming the building was built by some impossible mechanism. The Palace Hotel is a marvel of 1870s engineering, absolutely. But it is also a marvel that should have left more documentary evidence, particularly in the intermediate stages. If you wanted to understand how American builders solved the problem of erecting a 7-story cast iron frame structure in a boom town without reliable rail infrastructure or standardized supply chains, the construction photos should be dense with evidence. Load-bearing sequences, crane mechanisms, material staging areas, labor deployment patterns. Instead, we get what I would describe as edited silence, not blank silence. That would be understandable. Edited silence. We have the before, we have the after. The middle has been visually compressed to near invisibility. This matters because of what happened next. In 1879, 3 years after the Palace Hotel opened, the Vanderbilt Mansion began construction on New York's Fifth Avenue. 12 stories, 250,000 square feet. an architectural complexity that makes the Palace Hotel look like a warm-up exercise. Where the palace was geometric and rational, the mansion was ornamental, intricate, demanding a level of craftsmanship and coordination that seems almost impossible to compress into a conventional timeline. The official duration was 3 years. Completion, 1882. Now ask yourself a specific question. How do you quarry, transport, and prepare enough limestone, quality limestone, dressed limestone, fitted limestone, for 250,000 square feet of exterior wall, when your transportation infrastructure is horse-drawn carts? How do you do that in 3 years? Not how would you do it in theory. How did they actually do it? The photographic record from the Vanderbilt mansion construction shows finished stages, shows ornamental details, shows the scale, but the actual process, the coordination of the stone suppliers, the quarries, the transport routes, the placement sequences, that's where the documentation becomes thin, not missing, thin, strategically thin, and then something begins to repeat. By 1880, builders were launching projects of increasing ambition across the United States, but not everywhere, in specific cities, with specific timing, using specific architectural vocabularies. Chicago, New York, Boston, San Francisco, Philadelphia, and then almost immediately the pattern begins to appear in secondary cities: Cincinnati, Denver, St. Louis, Minneapolis. Between 1880 and 1895, these cities underwent a transformation that has no clear precedent in architectural history. Buildings that required simultaneous solution of multiple coordination problems were erected in rapid sequence. Structural problems, how to achieve unprecedented heights with limited materials, material problems, where to source the volume of finished stone, glass, iron, logistics problems, how to move materials efficiently using 1880s infrastructure, labor problems, how to organize and coordinate the number of workers required, technical problems, how to ensure tolerances and quality control on projects of this scale. For each of these problems, the architectural record shows solutions. Elegant solutions, consistent solutions, but the documentation of how those solutions were derived, sparse. Take the matter of stone. The buildings of the 1880s required unprecedented volumes of dressed stone. Limestone, granite, marble, facing stone. The quarries had to expand. The tools had to become more efficient. The transportation had to become more reliable. The placement sequences had to become more sophisticated. I'm not saying where this stone came from. I'm asking where it can be documented to have come from. Official quarry records for the period are fragmentary. Quarry photographs are few. Transport documentation is sparse. What we have is finished stone in finished buildings, exquisitely finished, perfectly toleranced, but the chain of custody from extraction through placement, that's the missing middle. Here's another specific problem: glass. The buildings of the 1880s featured glass on a scale that had never been attempted. Large panes, uniform quality, tempered where required. Consistent dimensions. Prior to 1880, American glass manufacturers were producing glass in small quantities, with relatively high rejection rates due to imperfections. Between 1880 and 1890, that capacity expanded. Documentation of that expansion is surprisingly thin. The glass manufacturers' records exist, but they show sudden jumps in capacity. Capacity that was in place before the building projects that required it, not after, not in response to demand, before. This is the coordination problem in its most acute form. Supply had to precede demand. Materials had to be positioned before they were needed. Decisions had to be made about quality standards before those standards had been tested at scale. The photographic documentation of how this coordination was achieved, fragmentary. Now let's expand the geographic scope. By 1890, the pattern had crossed the Atlantic. London, Paris, Vienna, Suddenly, these cities launched ambitious building campaigns that paralleled, with eerie consistency, the American projects. Same architectural vocabularies, same structural solutions, same material problems, same timeline. This alone is noteworthy because international coordination in the 1890s was slow. Communication was slow. Design knowledge traveled by mail. Yet the architectural solutions that emerged in Vienna appear to have been derived independently from the solutions in Chicago, yet they are internally consistent with them. Not identical, consistent. The Ringstrasse expansion in Vienna, particularly the later phases, 1888-1896, required the same material sourcing, the same labor coordination, the same technical problem solving that was occurring simultaneously in American cities. The documentation is similarly structured: finished buildings, exquisite details, but sparse intermediate process. Then, more concerning, the pattern appears in Russia. I need to be precise about what I'm claiming here because the implication is destabilizing. I'm not claiming that the buildings were constructed by impossible means. The buildings are real. They exist. The techniques are known. The materials are accountable. What I am claiming is that the documentation of the construction process is conspicuously incomplete in a pattern that suggests intentional curation. Specifically, we have extensive documentation of 1870s-era construction practices. General techniques were known, widely published, and photographed. We have dense documentation of 1920s construction practices. The technological jump is clearly visible in the photographic record. But the crucial decades, 1880-1900, show a selective documentation that emphasizes completion and de-emphasizes process. The buildings that rose during these decades required solutions to 5 interdependent problems. 1. Structural tolerance. Cast iron and steel frames required precision fitting that previous construction methods had never demanded at this scale. 2. Material supply. Sourcing of finished materials at scale across intercontinental distances required coordination mechanisms that either didn't exist yet or existed in fragmentary form. 3. Labor coordination. Managing hundreds of workers across months-long projects with no electrical power on site and limited communication technology. 4. Quality control. Ensuring that materials from different suppliers met consistent specifications. 5. Knowledge transfer. Ensuring that construction techniques developed in one city could be replicated in another city, often on another continent, with consistent results. The photographic and written documentation we have does not adequately explain how any of these 5 problems were solved. We have the results. We do not have the process. This matters because these problems were not trivial. They were, in fact, the hardest problems in the technological history of the 19th century. Yet the solutions appear in the architectural record, without adequate documentation of the problem-solving process itself. Here is the destabilizing question. If the solutions to these problems were derived through trial and error, through experimentation, through failed attempts and iteration, as is normal in technological development, where is that evidence? Where are the intermediate buildings that show the learning curve? Where are the partial collapses that required retrofitting? Where are the documented failures that led to better techniques? We see this clearly in other technologies of the era. Railroads show it. Bridge engineering shows it. Mechanical systems show it. There is a dense record of experiments, failures, refinements, and breakthroughs. But the building construction record shows something different: rapid adoption of sophisticated techniques with minimal documented experimentation phase. The pattern repeats with remarkable consistency across the geographic expansion from 1880 to 1896. Then it stabilizes. After 1896, the documentation becomes denser. The techniques become standardized. The explanation becomes clear. Skyscrapers and megastructures continue to rise, but the mystery, the specific quality of fragmentary documentation surrounding their rise, evaporates. Why? Let me propose a specific hypothesis, while being explicit that it is a hypothesis about documentation loss, not about the buildings themselves. The buildings exist. They are real. They are standing. They are documented in their finished state. What may have been lost is the intermediate documentation, the construction photos, the engineer's notes, the quarry records, the labor logs, the supply manifests that would explain how the coordination problems were solved. This is not a trivial loss. The loss of process documentation has real consequences. First, it means we cannot adequately teach modern builders how to accomplish complex projects with limited technological infrastructure. The problems solved by 1880s builders are increasingly relevant. How to coordinate global supply chains, how to maintain quality control across distributed manufacturing, how to manage complex labor logistics. Yet the documentation of how these problems were solved is fragmentary. Second, it means we cannot verify the techniques that were actually used. We can infer techniques from finished buildings. We can reverse engineer some processes. But this is archaeology, not history. It is reconstruction, not documentation. Third, and most problematically for historians, it creates a gap in our understanding of technological development. We have documentation of technologies before the leap, 1870s, and after the stabilization, 1920s. But the crucial intermediate period, the moment when the leap was occurring, is oddly silent. I'm not saying this silence is intentional. I'm not saying it's evidence of anything extraordinary. What I'm saying is that it is peculiar. It is specific. It is consistent across geographies in a way that random documentation loss would not be. The hypothesis, then, is simple. We may have lost access to documentation that would make the construction logistics of the 1880s transparent. That documentation may have been lost to deliberate archival selection, keeping only finished building photos, discarding process photos, economic loss. Construction companies disposed of documentation when they went out of business, technological loss. Original records were kept in formats that did not survive, geographic loss. Records that existed in one country were not transferred to historical societies elsewhere. Any of these could explain the pattern. None of them requires extraordinary explanation. All of them are plausible. But the fact remains. The buildings rose with documentation of their completion. The documentation of their rising is fragmentary. The knowledge of how the coordination problems were actually solved may have been lost with the builders who solved them. What we are left with is this: a pattern of architectural ambition that rises across 3 continents in a compressed time window. A pattern of consistent solutions to identical problems. A pattern of accomplished fact without adequate documentation of the accomplishment. The buildings stand. They are real. They teach us that humans in the 1880s could solve problems of scale and coordination that we would struggle with today. But the knowledge of how they solved them, that may be permanently lost to us. This is not mysterious in the supernatural sense. It is mysterious in the historical sense. We have lost access to knowledge that our predecessors possessed. We have fragmentary documentation where we need comprehensive understanding. We have finished structures where we need process explanation. The question is not, how were these buildings built? The question is, why don't we have documentation that adequately answers that question? And perhaps most unsettling, what other knowledge have we lost? What other processes have gone undocumented? What other coordination problems were solved by previous generations, leaving us with only the results and not the methods? The megastructures of the 1880s stand as monuments to that lost knowledge, elegant, unexplained, unchanged, and fundamentally, frustratingly unknowable in their making.